we almost need to revisit. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about Parshas Vayesha, we spoke about the particular attributes of Yehuda. Yehuda is really defined by the person who takes responsibility. You might notice that in multiple occasions. The way he says Tzod Kol Mimeni, the episode of Tamar, the guarantee that he provides, of course, for Binyamin to his father Yitzchak, which is something we see the conclusion of course, in this week's parsha. And there are other examples as well. Here we have a fascinating difference of approach in the Rishonim as to how to understand Yehuda's style and approach in the way in his famous speech, his famous appeal to Yosef on behalf of his brother at the beginning of the parsha. So maybe the more familiar pshat, as always, is Rashi. Rashi says, the second Rashi in the parsha, it says, he says, do not be angry. Do not be angry with your servant. Don't be angry with me with what I'm about to say to you. It says Rashi, you see from here that he didn't mince his words, that he spoke to him in a very harsh manner, right? The Sifsei Chachomim says, not in the normal way, the normal way in which a person would speak to royalty. Normally, when you speak to royalty, you would speak Beloshen Rach, Sofarofa, a gentle tongue, in an appropriate and respectful way. Here, he set his path out in the beginning and says, I'm going to be speaking to you in a harsh manner. And you find that Rashi continues on the same theme. So the next Rashi is Ki Chomecha Paroi, because like you are like Paro. So Rashi brings several different shotim. Each one seems to be worse than the next in terms of the harshness of how he spoke to Yosef. He said, just like Paro decrees and doesn't fulfill his promises, you're the same. All you wanted to do was just look at him and look what you've done now. You're taking him away now. And he says, if you anger me, I'll kill you and I'll also kill your master. But the truth is that if you were learning the psukim without the medrash, you were just reading the psukim, you could argue the opposite. You could argue that in fact he's speaking to him in a very respectful way. The whole approach, ki chomecha kafara, you to me are like Paro. Let me speak to you. Let me approach you. And fascinatingly, this is in fact the approach of Rabbeinu Bachai. Rabbeinu Bachai is a beautiful piece at the beginning of the parsha. He brings a pasuk in Mishlei. The pasuk in Mishlei says, and we quote this in the Piyutim on Shoshana and Yom Kippur, I think, it says, "Mane rach yoshiv chemo," that a soft answer turns away wrath, anger. Duvar otsev, that's something that is almost like, it literally means something that brings, otsev means sadness. We'll come back to that a little bit later on, but that causes yala'af, that brings anger. If you speak in an angry tone, if you speak in a way that aggravates, that leads to anger. Says the Rabbeinu Bachai that Shlomo HaMelech's great lesson in this posuk in Mishlei is that a person needs to try their utmost to effectively accustom themselves, particularly in a moment of great danger, of great anger, of great possibility for strife, to respond in a soft manner. He says that speech has tremendous power, either for good or for the opposite. And it is, as we know, the very essence of what it means to be human. Adam became a nefesh chaya. What does that mean? The Targum famously says, "L'ruach mamalo," in Parshas Bereshis, becomes a speaking being. That itself is what makes us human, and that is why the pasuk talks about and refers it to the way in which Hashem speaks, because it is something which is so spiritual, it's so holy, therefore has to be used in the correct manner. He says that when Shlomo HaMelech says "Mane rach yoshiv chemo" in Mishlei, what he's doing is he's telling us that in a moment of strife, in a moment of danger, that can make all the difference, the tone one uses. And he says like this, he says that this was the approach that Yehuda took. He spoke to Yosef Beloshen Rach, in a soft tongue, and that was how he turned things around. That was what made Yosef change. He says, "V'yodua etznon ki lo haya roye kas liYosef amalei nefso min agvia. Kim liYoda v'yesachim anakim." Who should have been angry here? The people who should really have been angry was Yehuda and his brothers. Why? Because at the end of the day, they were the ones who they knew for a fact that the coast, the gvia, the cup, had been planted inappropriately. They knew that they were innocent, and nevertheless, even so, he says, Yehuda was a chacham gadol v'gibor b'gvuras haguf, b'gvuras hanefesh. He was incredibly strong physically, but also in his in the qualities of the nefesh, of the soul. He overcame his natural inclination for lokwas. He didn't become angry, even though it would have been fitting for him to become angry, he says. Yehuda saw that now was not the place for anger. He needed a lemane rach he needed that soft tongue in order to prevent the ongoing anger and the consequences of Yosef's anger. So it could be that this approach of Rabbeinu Bachai links very well with that whole piece that we described a few weeks ago about Yehuda's central attribute, his midah of being able to take responsibility. Yehuda is a leader because not only is he able to take responsibility and show leadership as he does here, but he is what the Rabbeinu Bachai calls a gibor b'gvuras haguf, and also in the nefesh. He understands that power alone is never enough. It also requires great chokhmah and wisdom. And therefore he knows that now is the time for mane rach, now is the time for a soft approach rather than a forceful approach. What does this approach achieve? What does Yehuda do? How do we see and where do we see the effect of Yehuda's actions? So there's actually a malbim on that posuk in Mishlei. The malbim says, what is the difference between af and chemo? The beginning part of the posuk talks about mane rach, a soft tongue, yosh chemo, alternatively, which actually maybe it's wrath, dvar etzev, and something which is the opposite of that. That is, in other words, it is something which is harsh, if you like. Yale af, it brings up anger. So says the malbim on this posuk. He says that he says like this. He says that a person. He says that a mane shemeshiv mane rach. These are his words. When a person answers in a soft tongue, yoshiv gam hachem hapnimis, he manages to change even the inner anger. Yoshev ha'oyev la'oyev, and the enemy can become one who is beloved instead. They can become best friends. He says that what chemo really is, he says the af is on the surface. Wrath, anger is something on the surface. It's a visible anger. Chemo, he says, is something internal. It's something inside. That is the difference between them. And when a person is angry on the outside, what really counts is the wrath and the anger inside. That's what's really significant. That is what's really significant. The ability to answer in a soft and gentle tongue can even change that. What happens is that this causes a real and genuine transformation in attitude. That's what the Malbim is telling us. That the mane rach will change, make a deep and internal change. It changes the oyev to the oyev, the enemy to the one who is beloved. Yosef's almost his first words after Yehuda's finished his speech. The first words is he says to just find the pasuk after Yehuda's speech, just at the beginning of Sheni. He says, sorry, it's the beginning of Perek Mem Aleph, Perek Mem Hey, sorry, Mem Hey pasuk Aleph. It says, "V'lo yochol Yosef lehesapek." Yosef could no longer bear l'chol nitzov malov, and he called out, "Hutziu chol ish me'olai." He says, "Take everyone away. I don't want anyone here anymore." He didn't want anyone there when he revealed himself to his brothers. So the Mefarshim explain that Rashi says this, others as well, that he couldn't bear the shame, the embarrassment that his brothers would have to face when he effectively said, "I'm actually your brother who you sold into slavery." But did you ever ask yourselves the risk that Yosef was taking here, right? He is a very powerful man. He's only powerful because of his position and because of his entourage. If there is no one there apart from himself and all his brothers, and at that moment he turns around and says, "Ani Yosef, I'm Yosef, and he's the only one there. He must know with 100% certainty that they have now become the Oyhavim, right? That they have now become Oyhavim instead of Oyvim. They have now become beloved friends instead of enemies. That is the power and the effect of Yehuda's speech. it transforms the attitude so that in a sense, he's not risking his life. The Rebbeinu Bachar also points out this idea of the risk of the potential danger. He's a medrash. The medrash says, "But Tzara Gedol Hevi Yosef Yosef was in incredible danger because if they killed him, no one would know. They could say, "Oh, let's do away with him now. Look what he's done to us. He's caused us tremendous pain. Our father, our brother, all of us, we've been in tremendous difficulty because of him." But he knew, because that was the power of Yehuda's words. A real leader knows that sometimes that gentle word in the right place can change everything, make all the difference. That's the power of Yehuda's speech here to Yosef. Move on to something else now. There are two opposing, if you like, different emotions expressed in this parsha. I call them emotional odysseys in the little heading I sent out earlier. There is a powerful representation of an emotion of tovin, of sadness, but also of something called chedva, which is a particular form of simcha. And we'll deal with them one at a time. Perek Mem Hey, Posuk Hey. Yosef, at the beginning of his speech to his, when he says to his brothers, he says, "V'ata, and now, al te'otzvu, do not be sad. V'alichar be'einechem, don't let them be angry in your eyes. That you sold me here. Because Hashem has sent me in order to keep alive, basically, the Egyptians and everyone else." It's actually not, Rashi says it's not really the Egyptians. The focus here is on them. I was sent ahead in order to make sure you will be able to survive. That's the whole setup here. I'm the one in order to, Rashi, the Pasuk carries on. Hashem has sent me in front of you. Basically, it's all Hashem's plan. It's all set up from him. So don't be sad and don't be upset. The Toras Chaim here, if you look at the Toras Chaim, he says there's a few problems, difficulties here with this Pasuk. He says, he asks a few questions. One of his questions is very striking is the two phrases are actually opposites. He says, "Do not be sad, al te'otzvu," and then he says, "V'alichar be'einechem," don't be angry. Now, sadness is really, they're brokenhearted, right? They're brokenhearted because of what's happened, right? There's a tremendous sadness, and he senses that sadness. So he wants to say to them, "Don't be sad." And then there's something else, which is charoin af. Don't be angry. Now, anger is the opposite emotion in a sense, right? Because a person would only be angry if there is a sense of gaiva, of pride, of haughtiness. How can you be both shivering lave, right? How can you both be brokenhearted and sad and at the same time be angry? And therefore, as a result of that, what the Toras Chaim does is he splits them into two. He separates the Tzovon and the Yichar Beinechem. And he says, really, the second phrase, the anger in your eyes, the anger they felt, that's really responded to. He says to them, the anger that you've caused, and that you've had to suffer, okay, as a result of all the bowing down you've had to do, the way you've been treated, effectively, it's almost like the anger you might feel with yourselves that has led you to this, that has made you undergo this whole business. He says, for that, understand that it's Hashem's plan. Understand Kila Michya. Understand that Hashem has sent you because it's his plan, because he wanted things to be organized before you arrived here, and that was my job. When it comes to the first part, the first words, he almost treats that. Toras Chaim seems to treat that as a separate phrase. V'ato, and now al te'otzvu, do not be sad. And what did Yosef mean with those words? He says that Yosef was saying to them, I know how sad and regretful you are on the Mechira itself, on the selling. I know how much it pains you that you sold me. What is the specific pain that Yosef had heard them say? Last week's Parsha, in Parshas Miketz, Perek Mem Beis, Pasuk Chof Hey, they say, Aval Ashemim Anachnu. We are guilty. What are we guilty of? What are we guilty of? We are guilty of, and the way the Ramban understands that Pasuk over there, the Torah says that Aval Ashemim Anachnu, Asher Ra'inu Tzoras Nafsho, we saw his pain, when he appealed to us, he pleaded with us, V'lo Shomanu. We didn't listen. That's why this anguish has come upon us. That's what it says in Parshas Miketz. The Ramban there says, the Ramban al Torah says, that the brothers at that moment realized that the greatest crime that they had committed really was the crime of indifference. That they were able to hear Yosef crying to them and do nothing about it. The cruelty of indifference. And on that, says the Orach Chaim here, Yosef was saying, Va'ata, now al teotzvu. I see and I hear your sadness. I see your shame on the sense of the indifference, how indifferent you were. I see the pain. I see the regretfulness that you have within you on the pain, on the fact, because of the fact that you ignored my suffering. That idea, I heard you say, Hashem Manachnu, you were indifferent to my suffering. And you need to understand, he was saying to them, that has made all the difference to me. Because I understand that you now understand what it means to be indifferent to someone else's suffering. You've learned your lesson. To bring a more modern, if you like, context and illustration of this, on April the 12th, 1999, the East Room of the White House was on the 54th anniversary of the passing of President Roosevelt. The late great Holocaust survivor, Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, he actually delivered probably one of the most courageous speeches of all time. He addressed President Clinton. He described the depths of Auschwitz, Treblinka. He said the one consolation we had was the knowledge that we were living through an experience that we were sure was a complete secret outside the world. They said we knew that if Roosevelt and other leaders of the free world became aware of the existence of Auschwitz, he said, like, these were his words, if they knew, we thought, surely those leaders would have moved heaven and earth to intervene. They would have spoken out with great outrage and conviction. They would have bombed the railways, leading to Birkenau, just the railways, just one. He said the discovery after the war, said Elie Wiesel, that those leaders knew about Auschwitz was a terrible shock because they realized there was a level of indifference to the suffering of the victims. He said like this. He said the following words, incredibly powerful words. He said, indifference can sometimes be more dangerous than anger and hatred. He says, anger can at times be creative. Rashi understands, he didn't mention this, but look how Rashi understands Yehuda's approach at the beginning. According to Rashi, the anger had the effect, the opposite of Rabbeinu Bachai, right? Anger can at times be creative, Elie Wiesel said. One writes a great poem, a great symphony. One does something special for the sake of humanity because one is angry at the injustice that one witnesses. But indifference, he said, is never creative. Even hatred at times may elicit a response. You fight it, you denounce it, you disarm it. But indifference elicits no response. He said to be indifferent to suffering is to be indifferent to what makes the human being human. If we're indifferent to suffering, we become inhuman. And therefore, Yosef says, do not be sad, because now I recognize, I take that sadness that you've had, and I realize how you've changed. That's the power. That's the power of those words. I've realized that you've taken those steps. So that's the first emotion, the emotion of otsev and what that means, depth of meaning. The second one, Perek Memvov Posuk Chof Ches, we have Vayomer Israel, right? So the very first time, Yosef, we famously sends the wagons, the Agolos, which he sends the wagons to Yaakov, and that's how Yaakov knows it's true. Yaakov can't believe when he sees the wagons. Egla Rufa, Rashi, right? He knows that was they used to be, they were learning together, and he realizes that indeed Yosef is alive. What is the very first thing he said? Vayomer Yisrael, and Yisrael said, Rav, which when you translate, it's too much for me to bear. Oh, Yosef Benichai, Yosef, my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Now, what does that mean? That word Rav. Well, Torah says the first word he says is Rav, too much. The Rashi says, Rav li oid simcha v'chedva. There is now tremendous simcha and chedva for me. Hoil v'oid Yosef b'nichai. Since my son Yosef is still alive. Now, look at the Targum, interestingly, Targum Unclus. V'amar Yisrael, and Yisrael said, Sagi li chedva ad ka'an Yosef b'rikayon, right? Sagi li chedva. There's too much chedva for me. So Rashi brings simcha and chedva. Targum only uses the word chedva. And I just want to focus on that word chedva for a moment. What does that mean? What does the word chedva mean? We know there are many different words we use for simcha. In the Torah, we'll be familiar with the word chedva. Those who can still remember going to one. We have it in the Sheva Brachos, right? One of the list of the words that we use in the Sheva Brachos. We zocher to many simchas and mitzvah very, very soon. but this is one of the phrases in the phrases of Simcha there. What does Chedva mean? So the first time you have really the word Chedva alluded to in the Torah is with Yisro. Yisro says, "Vayichad Yisro," and Yisro rejoiced. Right? When he hears about everything that has gone on, and the Kriyas Yamsuf and Samalek, and he comes to meet the beginning of Parsha Shiur, and it says, "Vayichad Yisro," and Yisro rejoiced. That word they link to the word Chedva, rejoicing, Yichad Yisro. You also find it in the same word used in Sefer Nehemiah, when there's the description of when it talks about how they should celebrate Rosh Hashanah, even though they're feeling very sad and depressed. It says, he uses the phrase, Ki chedvas Hashem himo uskam. Your strength is your joy in Hashem. So what I've seen suggested is that the simcha of chedva is the simcha of rejoicing, the simchas chavera, and the simcha of someone else. That's what chedva is. You have simcha. Chedva is something else. Chedva is when you rejoice for someone else, for them, with them, in their happiness. And it could be, perhaps, that's why the Torah expresses the word, the simcha of Yaakov, if we take it as a simcha of chedva, as the Targum and Rashi do, that with the word rav, it's too much. Because Yaakov's true joy here was not just that he would see Yosef again. That's the next part. All I want is to see him again before I die. Yaakov's true joy was for Yosef. It was for his son. It was for him. It was a chedva in his simcha, because that he was alive. That boy would have a future after all. That was the real simcha. That he would have a future. That Yosef was a simcha for him. It was a joy b'simchas chavero, in the rejoicing of his friend. There is no greater simcha when we express joy for someone else, when we are b'simcha at someone else's simcha. We've all experienced that. When we are b'simcha at someone else's simcha, there is no greater joy. The hardest challenge for us now is the limited ways we have at expressing our joy for others. But if we find a way, if we can find a way, even in the circumstances we're in, to have simcha for others, it has the power to bring us the greatest simcha of all. That is what it can do. The greatest joy we can have is always rejoicing with someone else, for someone else's simcha. That was the true simcha of what Yaakov did here. That was the simcha b'simchas chavera. That was the chedva of Yaakov. Just 1 second. So one more piece I'd like to share with you in the last few minutes we have remaining. Rashi says at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, so the beginning of the whole story. Remember, you have to remember that this is one narrative. The whole episode from the beginning of Vayeshev till the end of Vayechi. Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. That is what it says in Parshas. In Rashi brings there. Yaakov wanted to dwell in tranquility. All he wanted was to be able to dwell in peace. That's all he wanted. Leishev b'shalva. What I think you have here in the parsha here, Perek Mem Zayin, Posuk Ches, is you have the outcome, if you like, and the realization, the final realization of Yaakov, where he realizes where he's ended up and what he's been through. You know, he says to Hashem that the way the Medrash explains it at the beginning of the whole episode of Yosef is, I've been through so much. I've been through so much pain. I've had Toras Esav, Toras Lavan, Toras Din. I've been through everything. Why do I have to have this pain as well? We have there, Perek Mem Zayin, Posuk Ches, one of the strangest dialogues in the whole Torah. He's brought in front of Yaakov. Paro says to Yaakov, excuse me, he says, can I just ask you, you look quite old. How old are you? And Yaakov says, Yaakov says to Paro, 130 years old, and then I've had an awful life, he says. It's been terrible. I haven't lived a very long time, he says, and they've been very bad. And they haven't even, I haven't even come close to the years of my forefathers. And the question here is obvious. Firstly, it's a strange thing to say to someone, right? So what is Paro saying? How old are you? By the way, he meets this elderly gentleman. Can you just tell me your age? It seems inappropriate. And then Yaakov's response, you'd think, great Yaakov Avinu, what is he going to say? he's going to say, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. He doesn't. He says, I've had an awful life. What's going on in the dialogue? There's a beautiful shot from Shmuel Alter, who was nifta, I think, around 50 years ago. He was the Rav, I think, in Vienna, and then interesting enough, I think, in Cuba. He says like this. He says the real question of Paro was not just how old are you. He said Paro was saying to him, "You're clearly an old man. Tell me, why did you bother? Why on earth have you bothered to come all the way at this stage in your life? This stage in your life, you've uprooted your whole family to come and live in Mitzrayim, right? It's enough. You're old. Why on earth did you do this? What was it worth it for you? You're an old man. Why did you bother?" And Yaakov responds by saying, "My years have been ma'at v'ro'im. They've been few and miserable. And that is why I came. Because I will never give up," he said, "on my quest to do the right thing. I will never give up. I will never give up. I will always continue, starting again, trying again, something else. I've always, in my life, I've always tried," Yaakov was saying, "to accomplish the things I wanted to achieve, to accomplish and reach the spiritual heights. Should I give that up just because I'm old? No, on the contrary. On the contrary, an opportunity has been given to me," he said, "to grow, for new spiritual experiences, for a new, if you like, adventure of life, a new opportunity. Maybe because," Yaakov was saying, "my years have been ma'at v'roim, because they've been so difficult, I've got a deeper insight into the power of each year, into the amount I can achieve with each year, and that's why I keep going." And according to this, maybe we can suggest, if that was really the dialogue between Paro and Yaakov, Paro is saying, "Why did you bother?" And Yaakov says, "Of course I bothered, because just because I'm old doesn't mean I shouldn't bother, doesn't mean I shouldn't try something else, I shouldn't try something new, I shouldn't continue growing and striving in life." And it could be according to that this is where it begins to come full circle. At this stage, maybe Yaakov has finally understood and internalized the message of that, as Medrash tries to express at the beginning of Vayeshev. Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Yaakov wanted to dwell in tranquility. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you can't understand the depth of the ways of Hashem. The unfortunate struggle with that whole Medrash. They struggle with understanding it. Surely, why can't tzaddikim ask for tranquility? Why can't they? And maybe the depth of that is not understandable. Maybe it's something that we can't fully understand. We can't understand the why. But Yaakov has learned at this stage that the fact that he's old, the fact that there's other things coming all the time, means that doesn't mean that he should ever give up. On the contrary, he must always keep going. When he says my years are ma'at v'roim, he means I intend to make every single one of them count, every single day count, every moment count, every year, however old I become. That is the dialogue between Yaakov and Paro. That is what I think we learn from this parsha specifically, as the gift of old age and the gift that can be if one approaches it with the correct attitude. I thank you all very much for listening. Wish you all a good evening, a good Shabbos. Please, those who would like to join us tomorrow morning for a special share on vaccinations at 9:15 a.m. The same Zoom link. Hope you all stay safe and well. Have a good evening.
Good. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you so much. Good.
Thank you very much.
Some of us have had our vaccines already. It's a bit late.
Well, you can still listen to the share. Okay.
Okay.
You could serve the vaccine.
Vaccine.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Have a good evening. Pass well.